Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again tomorrow. It's Friday, Parashat Tisa, also Parashat Para. We are in the midst of a great international, worldwide crisis known as the coronavirus, and everyone is beside themselves. The world situation is falling apart. People are, all over the world. The hospitals are overly populated now, and not enough machines to take care of the ill. The financial markets are falling apart. What's happening in the world today? Obviously, the answer always lies in the Torah. And we have to look to God and look for the Torah for spiritual support and hope that if we follow and we will follow the Torah and we will find answers to questions now. The greatest pain that we have in our time is that we lack prophets, that are outright prophets today. There are many holy people, the people that study and are very, very close to God in the world. But we lack prophecy as we had way back. And that's something that we're promised at the end of days will return. And the greatest pain is not having someone who's so naturally connected to God in all ways, a prophet telling us what does God want from us for all these happenings. So we have to try to use our wisdom and look into the Torah and learn from our prophets that existed in the past until prophecy returns, and we will hear Hashem's voice. The whole world will be enlightened for the spiritual redemption and the physical redemption of humanity, right? Which is we hope for and we pray for. But right now, this kind of things are like World War level events that are taking place. And I'd like to just mention a few points in this week's portion I think that we have to pay attention to and we have to be aware of. And one of the greatest sins that we remember in history, if someone asks what was one of the greatest sins that Israel committed after coming out of Egypt, everyone's going to jump out and say, well, the sin of the golden calf, right, or the sin of the spies. Those are the two really powerful sins that stick out more than anything, although there are other sins along the 40 years in the desert after we were delayed. We were supposed to enter the land beforehand. And this week's portion focuses on that sin. Moshe Rabbeinu is coming down from Mount Sinai with the tablets and ready to give the light of Torah to Israel. And this will change the whole world, having Torah brought down. And all of a sudden, Moshe Rabbeinu comes down from the mountain, and he's hearing, Joshua's telling him there's something going on in the camp, and Moshe Rabbeinu walks into the camp, and he sees the terrible atrocity going on, the worshiping of the golden calf. And he breaks, he takes this, he smashes the tablets, he breaks them, and he takes the calf, and he grinds it up, and he burns it, and he throws it into the water, and those of Israel, the water that they drink, and they drink the water. And people die from that. Some died from drinking the water. There were 3 different levels we see of punishment. Number 1, those who drank the water tested them to see who actually sinned, right? Because if there was no warning in Judaism, requires Jewish law, Torah law requires that before a person is punished, he must be warned. So what happens if there was a witnesses to a crime, but they didn't get a warning before and telling them you're not allowed to do so? So the judgment, the court of Israel cannot punish because there's no warning. There has to also be a warning besides actually seeing the crime. So this talks about capital punishment, right? Serious crimes. And therefore God, Moshe Rabbeinu had to test them with the water. Okay, there was no witness. We can't do a court down here because we don't have again a warning wasn't given before, although there are witnesses. So drink the water, and then God will test them, like drinking the waters of the sota. You're all familiar with the sota. When a woman husband is found her alone with another man, and he said, "Don't do that again," and then she goes anyway. He doesn't know if she committed a crime with that other man, but she drinks the water to test her her faith to see if she was truly loyal to her husband or not. We know that famous chapter in the Bible, which talks about that in the portion in the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, Parashat Naso. So similarly here, they were tested by drinking the water. That was one test. And those who committed the crime, they died from drinking that water with the gold within it. The Ramban Nachmanides goes on to say that it actually went through the system and came out, like literally in their feces, showing how what kind of a disgrace this was. Thinking about that, the idol, the believing in it, they're eating it, it's literally coming out of the other end. Literally, the description is very, very powerful. And that's one test. And we go on to see, there were others. Moshe Rabbeinu goes on and he says, he calls out to the Levites and he says, who? Mi Lashem Elai, who is for God? Come to me. And the Levites come to Moshe Rabbeinu. And they go ahead and they kill, literally with the sword, those who committed the crime. And here, the rabbis explain that, the Israeli courts just don't go out and kill, but they have to make sure that those who saw, first of all, they received a warning about not to commit this terrible atrocity of idol worship, and after receiving the warning, they went ahead and did it anyway. So then they get punished for it. So Moshe Rabbeinu sends out the Levites, and they go out and they kill 3,000. Were punished in that way. Now that other punishment is capital punishment. That's the second group of punishment we see. So the first group was with the water. The second group was these that were punished through the Levites. And then, very interestingly, that's what I want to really focus more on, we see the third group. What is the third group? We see that God himself punishes. Let me read some of these verses here, and I'd like to read. It's in chapter 32. In chapter 32, verse number... verse number 35 is the end. God says, Vayigov Hashem et ha'am, and God sends a plague to the nation. Al asher asu et ha'egel asher asaron. Right? For those who did the egel. So what was this plague all about? Who was to be punished now? Right? After the 3,000 people that committed the crime actually worshiping the egel, and the other group they didn't receive warning that they also committed, so they were punished already. So who was left now? Who was left? If we see the words, it says on verse number 30, the next day, Moshe says to the nation, you did a great sin. What kind of great sin? Those who sinned were killed already. They were punished. And why does God then punish this third group? In verse 35, by sending a plague. And Nachmanides explains this plague could have been spread out. For a while, people were dying of a plague, of some kind of corona. What's going on over here? So the point is very fascinating. I saw in a few different commentaries that explain that the sin of this third group, what was the sin all about? Was those that were standing by. Those that were witnesses to the terrible atrocity of the golden calf, and they did not try to stop it. Or they were sort of complacent in their hearts, let them go do this. They were ignoring it. They were totally indifferent to it. Or they didn't speak out enough. Maybe it bothered them also, but they didn't speak out and prevent. We call this in Hebrew the mitzvah, the important commandment of tochacha, of reproof. When you see somebody doing something they shouldn't be doing, you have to speak out. So this third group that was punished with this plague, with the coronavirus, we say, this third group, was a group that could have made a difference if they would have speak out and tried to prevent those from doing the atrocities that were done, and they died in the third way. God himself sent a plague upon them. So to summarize what we studied so far, we saw three groups. We saw the group of the water, and the group that with the Levites killed, and here the group that God himself sends a plague to. And those, we said, this last group was those who did not give reproof. And here I'd like to bring, it's a very, very important point. I want to here skip over to Ezekiel the prophet here. Let me take us out of it. If we look in the prophet Yechezkel, Ezekiel, and this is in chapter, small letters here, this is in chapter 8 of the book of Ezekiel. And I'll explain a couple of words here. Ezekiel, we know, he was banished from Israel with the exile to Babylon with Yechoniah, right? The king Yechoniah, and this was in the 6th year of the story that takes place now is the 6th year of the banishment of Yechoniah, the king, to Babylon. And this is we're talking about very, very just a few years before the destruction of the temple. And here in chapter 8, and Yechezkel actually gives dates over here, and he says, and he sees, I'm going to try to summarize quick, I'm not going to read all the verses, but Ezekiel says that he's taken, in his vision, he's having a prophetic vision, and he's taken by his hair, he's pulled by his hair literally, and brought back to Jerusalem. He's brought back from Babylon. Now Kval, by the river of Kval he's on. And he's brought back to Jerusalem to witness the terrible atrocities that are being committed inside the temple itself. And descriptions of how the women would actually make the idol of Tammuz cry by burning the lead within the eyes and looking like it's crying. All kinds of things, crazy things, the descriptions of the idol worship that was going on. And then after that description, we see something very, very interesting. And if you look in chapter 9, from verse number 4 and onward, Vayomer Hashem elav avo betoch ha'ir, betoch Yerushalayim. And God tells him, go into the city, into Jerusalem. V'dvita tav al mitzchot hanashim hanenachim v'nenakim al kol ha'toivot hanasot betocha. I want you to place like a mark, a letter. A tav is like some kind of symbol, a letter, a sign on the foreheads, right, of those who are crying from all the and screaming out from all the terrible atrocities that are being done. I want you to do that. Okay. If we look again, I'm sorry if I'm speaking a little Hebrew stuff, but so we look over here. First of all, so they were told to place, and here we're talking about the Malach, the angel Gabriel, to put on these signs on the foreheads of those who were screaming out over the terrible atrocities of being committed in Jerusalem. And then we see something very, very interesting. If we see in verse number 6, it says, Zaken, the elder, the Bachor, Betula, the Bachor, the young men and the women, the Taf and Hashim and the children, the Ta'gu mashchit v'al kol ish asher alav atav. So it says, begin to send out the mashchit, the terrible plague, to all those who were sitting with the terrible atrocities. And then it goes on to say, it says, but those who have the sign on the foreheads, the tav, al tigashu mikdashi tachelu, right? Don't go over to those who have the sign on the foreheads, but begin with the temple, mikdashi tachelu. And it began with the elders before the house. Now here, it's a little, doesn't make sense in a little bit. It said beforehand, right, that there are people that have these signs on the forehead, and I don't want you, and those, right, we say those who got the signs because they're crying out over what's going on in Jerusalem. And then it says, began with the elders. Now, the elders is a word that shows the wise, those who are usually the ones who are loyal to God and the ones who are crying. So there's something that has to be worked out. And here I want to bring down a Talmudic passage. The Talmud talks about this in the tractate of Shabbat. And it talks about that there was there were in the house of the head of the exile, those who needed reproof. And the rabbis went over and they said, one actually went over to one of the other rabbis and said, why don't you reprove them what they're doing? They're doing a terrible, terrible thing. And he said, they're not going to listen to me. They're not going to listen to me anyway. So he said, nevertheless, you must reprove them. And he brings down an example of what happened over here in the story of Ezekiel. We see that people were actually crying out and they were discussing what was going on, was bothering them. And nevertheless, the Talmud goes on to say that when the time came to begin the plague for those who were, from the Jerusalem, the terrible tragedy, from the Malach, the angel of Gabriel, who actually meted out this plague, the Talmud goes on to say that it began with who? It began with those who were those who cried and those who it bothered them what was going on, the terrible atrocities that were happening. The plague began with them, and the question is why though? Before Ezekiel's told that they're going to have these signs on their foreheads, and those who get the signs are going to be protected. But the opposite happened. God changed His mind, and it began with b'mikudashai, those who are holy to me. So that's what and it says mikdashi, meaning the temple, but can also be those who are holy to me, mikudashai, Talmud says. So in other words, we see a terrible atrocity that's taking place in Jerusalem, and the first ones to be punished are not the ones who are worshiping the idols, but those who were crying, it was bothering them, and they will punish first. And here, the Talmud teaches something very powerful. Why would they punish first? And the Talmud answers, because they did not give reproof. And the question the Talmud says, they wouldn't listen. We know for sure they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't listen. And the answer was, how did they know they wouldn't listen? They should have went out and they should have tried to prevent the terrible atrocities that were going on. Because they did not give the rebuke. The word is you rebuke. They did not rebuke their fellow Jews that were sinning terribly. And they were remaining silent on the side. They were crying. It was bothering them. But that wasn't enough to even cry. They should have went out and tried to prevent them from doing this terrible atrocity. The Talmud tells us that they were marked first. That tav that we're wearing on the foreheads became the sign that they were going to be the first to be hit. So the plague began with them. That's a terrible, terrible tragedy. And not only that, we see that where it all began, the Talmud explains that it began literally with the Levites were singing their songs in the temple. That is where it all began, where the Levites were singing the songs in the temple. Now, why did I bring down the story here in Ezekiel connected here? Because it's exactly parallels to what we learn here in our portion, where the third group here that God sends the plague to, just like here, was the group that stood aside and did not rebuke their brothers and sisters for sinning with the golden calf. But here it's a little different. How is it different? In the book of Exodus, they're the third group. They're the ones who were punished last. Unlike in the story of Ezekiel, they're the first ones to be punished. And why? Because here we see they should have learned from the example from the book of Exodus that the third group here, what did they do? They were just innocent bystanders. And the others were sitting with the golden calf. But the fact that they did not get involved and punished, they were plagued. The plague was sent out to them and they were punished with the plague. And therefore, they should have learned in the times of Ezekiel. The elders should have learned from that terrible happening and they could have made a huge difference. And they could have perhaps prevented, at least tried to do some kind of thing to prevent this terrible, terrible happening from going on, worshiping idols, and which led eventually, of course, to the whole destruction of the temple, which was very close to that time. Now, these are very, very powerful, powerful words and powerful teaching. Because to think about it, people that are against what's going on, and they're even crying about it, and they're shouting out to their families what's going on over here, it's not enough. And if that's the case, it's very scary. Because let's take it to modern times. How many terrible things go on in our society today, all over here in Israel? It's unbelievable. Things that are so painful that we see that are going against the Torah. The whole family unit is being destroyed. The way they're trying to, condone terrible atrocities of anywhere from even to say, like when, for example, I don't even talk about these things, but in the army, instead of getting a form you fill out today and you write down who is your parents, your father and your mother. It doesn't say father and mother, it says parent number one, parent number two. They have to be respectful for those who are, single, what's it called, homo parents or lesbian parents. These kind of things that people now are trying to, societies become so ingrained with the Western culture to accept norms that are totally against their abnormal things. And that those kind of terrible things that are going on in the world, in all of the Western culture in the world, are things that bring about terrible tragedies. When we have, for example, the sacred Sabbath that God gave us to rest on the Sabbath, how much it's so painful to see the terrible, what's it called, the profaning of the Sabbath. Of now in Israel, they were talking about public transportation on they're pushing for public transportation on the Sabbath in the land. And these are against God. Now here again, I'm not here to make judgments we are the judges in judging other people. But as a people of Israel, our culture is so natural. It was given to us through the Torah, defined by the Torah. And the Torah outlines our proper ethical behavior and how we're supposed to behave. And if those are just not reasons, again, how do we rebuke? There's another question, is how to rebuke. We're not living in biblical times when there's prophecy and people knew exactly how to behave and what to do. Obviously, we're living in a time where our reaction to our fellow members in this world, fellow human beings, has to be different to rebuke. Rebuke has to come today in our time period out of love, and it's not easy to rebuke others, right? It's a different kind of different time period now. But nevertheless, we must never give up on rebuking, and at least know that we tried our best to say and prevent terrible things from going on. People are afraid to call out against atrocities. Look how many abortions are being committed in the world. People are afraid to say, "Oh, I'm saying something against, one of these terrible things going on." Oh, so people are getting used to it. But no, these are ill, sick things that are going on in the world. They're ill, and those who commit these things are ill. They're not healthy individuals. They're not healthy human beings. And we have to call out and say we can't condone and support these things. Again, our reaction to people today, again, it has to be different than it was in the biblical times, because times have changed in the fact that prophecy and the humanity has come much further. And the rectification of our time is a different kind of rectification, how we're going to do it. The world needs love and to come back through true love. And that's another thing in itself. But I'm giving some examples. Now, because of the fact that we learned from the Bible that rebuke was not given when it should have been given, it brought about these terrible atrocities. And the plague we're talking about, or these plagues that took place later on. World society today is so entrenched in not only, again, the whole world, Israel, I'm talking about Israel now. Israel has to do the Sabbath. Israel has commanded to, again, of course, Noachites, the whole world is commanded to have a proper home and a kosher home, moral kosher home. But besides those issues, in the world, there are a lot of others, corruption, terrible corruption in the world, terrible bloodshed in the world, terrible things that the world sits aside, and the world knows how, on one hand, to accuse Israel of everything, but right in other places going on in the world, terrible atrocities where people are being murdered and abusing their own people, the world remains silent. Right? The world is remaining silent over that as well. And not to mention the fact that God is now, this whole thing of the corona, everyone feels what borders are all about. Now we know what our borders are. God is trying to give us boundaries and borders. It's all about boundaries and borders, this whole thing. Because now sometimes people have to go into these rooms in solitary confinement and feeling what it is to be sort of, given boundaries. The Western world has lost their boundaries. Now we're being told how to maintain our proper boundaries. Again, I'm trying to give some more examples of what's going on. We don't have to look far. Look at the terrible, terrible, terrible way. And again, I mentioned before, but the United Nations is constantly condemns Israel. And when Trump came out with the plan of the century, well, we got here the plague of the century. Again, we mentioned Trump is the best friend that ever came for Israel, and we have to appreciate that very much. We do appreciate it. But Israel can't remain aside and say, something, I'm not going to respond to saying, let's start with 70% giving away to the Arab world, a state, God forbid. Those are the biblical Bible borders of the land of Israel. God's telling us what borders are all about. Know your borders, know your boundaries, know Israel's boundaries. Israel's boundaries are outlined in the Bible itself. So again, these are reasons, there's terrible, the world is in uproar. And the way it relates to Israel causes a big problem. But Israel itself is suffering because Israel is supposed to be light to the nations. And when they're not behaving morally in all aspects, they're going to get hit. And again, and when it happens, sometimes God forbid, we see it can even start with the most righteous people getting hit because we don't rebuke enough. We don't go out and reach out and try to prevent these terrible things from happening. It's not easy. How do we now? In modern times, things don't work the way, as I mentioned before, the way they worked in the biblical times. But nevertheless, we have to reach out to our brothers and teach and educate and rebuke when rebuke needs to be given and let our voice be heard. It's not so simple. Very complicated world we all live in. And this is happening again. It's this crisis is in here. We're going to go to the synagogue tonight, and we're dividing into small groups to pray because we can't pray to more than 100 people in one room here in Israel, and schools are closed. It's people are afraid. People don't know what's going to be tomorrow. That's literally, God has brought us to a situation we have to scream out, and we have to rely on the Creator of the universe for help. Please stop this terrible, terrible plague that's killing so many people in the world, and it's going to kill so many more people in the world until a cure is found or a vaccine for this terrible thing. We also see, and I want to mention this week's portion, not how powerful a hint to this whole corona thing. In the words itself, if we look in chapter 37, we'll skip over there for a moment. Chapter 37, is it? Let me see over here. No, it's chapter 34. If we look over here, Moshe Rabbeinu finally is praying to Hashem that he should forgive Israel, and goes back for the third time to the mountain. He's praying. And he comes down with the second tablets. And I'll read this. We look at 34 chapter, verse number. Let's start with 28. Vayisham im Hashem 40 yom v'im layla. Moshe Rabbeinu was up there with God for 40 days and 40 nights. Lechem lo achal, u'mayim lo shata. He didn't eat bread and didn't drink water. Vayichtov al luchot et divrei habrit aseret advarim. He writes the 10 commandments on the tablets. Vayim mered Moshe mehar Sinai. He's coming down from Har Sinai. Ushnei luchot ha'idut. He's holding 2 tablets of testimony. Biad Moshe. Merideto min ha'ar. When he's coming down from the mountain. U'Moshe lo yada ki karan o panav v'dabro ito. Moshe Rabbeinu did not know that his face was coming like horns of light coming out of his face. Vayar Aaron and kol bnei Yisrael Moshe v'hinei karan o panav vayiru migeshber. Everyone saw his face and they had this lights coming out. They were afraid to get close to him. Stop here for a moment. First of all, we see Beredet Moshe Mahal Sinai. Moshe comes down from Sinai. What does Sinai sound like? In Hebrew, those who know Hebrew, how do we say China in Hebrew? Sin. Sin. Samach Yud Nun is sin, is China. Moshe Rabbeinu coming down from Sinai. Sin reminds us of the same letters of Sinai, sin, as China in Hebrew. This whole thing began there. We have to look at Sinai as where the answers we get from. The Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu is coming down from Sinai. And it says, Karan o panav, and his face was lit up. In Hebrew, right, Karan means, is like horns coming out of his face, but also what does it mean? Karan, what does it sound like? Corona, Karan. The same exact letters. We spell the word, the virus corona in Hebrew, the same letters here. Kuf, Reish, Nun. We just add 2 more letters, right? You say corona, they add a vav in the beginning, they add a vav hey at the end. Which is also fascinating. Corona in Hebrew means Keren, as I said here. It's Moshe Rabbeinu's mentioned 3 times over here that his face is lit up with the light of Sinai, the light coming from the Torah. And they're afraid to look at Moshe Rabbeinu because of the power. They see something happen, the experience of receiving Torah on Sinai. And the other letters, Vav Hey, the letters of the last 2 letters of Corona, the virus, are 2 letters of God's name. God has 4 letters in his most sacred name. We call it Tetragrammaton. Yud, Hey, Vav Hey. Those are the 4 letters. And we just read about this week we read about Amalek, last Shabbat Zachor. We read about the terrible Amalek coming against Israel. And Amalek's goal is to separate God's throne, to make God's name not complete. And God says his name will be complete, right? It's brought down in Exodus, Parashat by Bishalach, God brings down, it says, when by the war against Amalek, God's going to wipe out Amalek, and then God's name will be complete. What is God's name? The Yud Hey, the 2 letters there, it says, the war against Amalek, Ki Yad al Kesiyah. There it's mentioned only 2 letters of God's name. The 2 letters are missing of Vav Hey. The Corona sort of hints those 2 letters. What do those 2 letters reflect? Those 2 letters reflect the Netziv of Volozhin writes that the letter Vav Hey, those letters represent God's providence in this world. Right? The letter Vav is a Tiferet, it's in its Kabbalistic teachings, that represents the divine providence and in this world over here. And we have a challenge of seeing nature, the war nature against, right? What is the Yud Hey? That God created the world with the first 2 letters, Yud Hey. Creation of the world. The creation of the world is not enough for people to understand God created the world or to know that people live in a world. They know the world was created. But they have to realize that there's divine providence, that God watches over the world. And what happens is the forces of Amalek, those are the evil forces of the world. All those evil forces are all part of Amalek forces. And they want to separate God's name. They want to separate the creation of the world, or how the world was formed. They don't even want to believe in creation, right? They want to take that away from divine providence and try to. So the world is natural, runs by natural means. Nature runs the world. In the same way, they'll probably explain this virus is all natural, this is nature. But anyone who has any kind of human feeling in his heart knows this is so beyond, this is something that's apocalyptical. It's totally, Mashiach. It's totally the end of days kind of thing that we wouldn't imagine happening in our lifetime. The whole world is under siege, not by a world war. This is another kind of world war. And this thing is literally by a virus, something microscopic that is turning the whole picture of this entire world. And all for what purpose? To say we have to wake up tomorrow and scream out and do an act towards a moral world, a world of morals, a world that people respect one another and truly reach out to one another. There's so much good in the world. Let's not get me wrong. There's so much good in the world, but there's not enough. And there are a lot of things that have to be rectified. A lot of the terrible things going on in the world could be changed if humanity wakes up and hears the call. Here's God yelling out to us. I want my name to be complete in this world. I want you to see how the light of the Torah has to shine. And that's why Sinai, right? China. I said it starts with Sinai. Sin. That's where it began. Again, sign is where it all began. And if we see we don't connect to Torah, then unfortunately, when God's presence is not felt, and we don't connect to the spirituality and the morals of the Torah, and the world is in total chaos, and left just to man to decide what is moral, and then they make up the rules of morality, instead of realizing that there's a code that was given to all, not only in Israel, all of mankind. The Torah rectifies all of mankind, and that is so important to realize. That will rectify all our problems in the world. The world must repent. There's no doubt this is a time when such a terrible thing, a terrible crisis, the only answer to a terrible crisis is to try to strengthen our moral behavior and our giving and our helping people and reaching out and doing what we can to make this world a better place to live in. And that is what it says. Moshe Rabbeinu is coming down from Sinai. His face is totally glowing. People are afraid to look at him. And not only that, it says, what does it say? Vaitein al panav masfei, he's putting a mask over his face. What does that remind us? All these masks people are wearing, afraid of getting stuck with this virus, coming in contact with people who have the virus or perhaps germs, right? So they're trying to protect themselves with a mask. And here Moshe Rabbeinu would put the mask on for the opposite reasons. Why? Because he was so holy. That the holiness a person can't deserve to see, to bask in that holiness without being deserving of it. So while he's teaching Torah, he would take the mask off, letting the light shine. Showing the opposite here, everything in the materialistic world is the opposite, right, of holiness, right? A lot of times we have to take this material world and raise it up to holiness by sanctifying the world, and that's really reflected in the mask that Moshe Rabbeinu was wearing, and all the teaching we just saw now, to speak out against terrible things that go on and not be afraid to speak out against these terrible things and try to educate and reach out. So what happens? Someone comes over and says, what do you want? You're barbaric. It's ridiculous. I mean, the ones who are barbaric are those who have no respect again for humanity. It's so funny how they can speak out. All those very, very far away liberal people that are so anti-Torah, anti-Israel, and they can speak in the name of democracy. We can't. They're allowed to say what they want, but we can't try to teach and say what we want. They have respect for everyone else's opinions except opinions of the Torah. So it's not easy. They may they want to look at you or talk to you, etc. But at least you tried, and you have to try to reach out. And your sphere of influence. Everyone has a different sphere of influence. Those who have more a way of influencing others, let them speak out. And try to pick enough things to rectify. I just mentioned a couple of terrible things. We spoke about, to review them, I spoke about the terrible family problems, the breaking apart the families. People don't want to get married anymore, right? And again, the atrocities that go on of, abuse that we see goes on in this world. Terrible things go on. I mean, it's people dying of starvation. There are people, again, the murder that goes on, the rampage in places that they don't want to go into, the police in areas of the United States, in Chicago, what goes on. The terrible things in the world that we seem to be, okay, we're going on with it. But how can we make a change? How can we really it's not so simple. But there's something here that God is really calling out, something in this Western culture that has created this monster, that we have to realize we have to make a change and repent. And that will hopefully bring a terrible stop to this terrible tragedy. There's more to talk about. We can talk about the way the plagues are healed in the Ketoret, right? The special, we read about the ingredients of the incense, and that is a special remedy to stop the plague. We'll talk about it another time, God willing. But anyway, Shabbat Shalom, and let's take it to our hearts to rectify and to be good and to return to Hashem and reach out to our brothers and sisters and call to Hashem. It's time to return to God. Shabbat Shalom, Besarot Tovot, Yeshuot v'Nechamot.